Well, despite the treacherous journey crossing the Mediterranean Sea, the flow of African migrants trying to reach European soil is not stopping. At least 200 people were rescued after their 3 boats were damaged. Officials say the Libyan Coast Guard conducted the operation over the last few days. The UN says more than 30,000 migrants have died at sea since the year 2000. Well, this influx of African migrants is fueling the modern-day human slave trade, features exclusively on CNN. As you may recall, our reporting revealed migrants being sold as slaves in Libya.
A man addressing an unseen crowd. Big, strong boys for farm work, he says. 400. 700. 700? 800. The numbers roll in. These men are sold for 1,200 Libyan pounds, $400 apiece.
Well, the Ivory Coast is now calling on the International Criminal Court to indict criminals selling African migrants in Libyan slave markets. Well, CNN's exclusive report is triggering protests in several cities across France. Melissa Bell joins us now live from Paris. And Melissa, this is the 3rd protest we've seen in Paris since this exclusive report.
It is the 3rd protest within a week, Lynda, which gives you an idea of the anger that's been stirred up here in France, particularly because you have large populations of Malians, Chadians, Nigerians, precisely the nationalities that find themselves trapped in Libya. And I think that the word is not too strong. Clearly, the fate of these 700,000 to 1 million migrants who are currently in the country, some of them still hoping to make their way northwards to Europe, but increasingly effectively being pushed back. And the others, and there are many of them who are there and have decided that they just want to pack up and go home, but for the time being can find no safe way out. Clearly, the fate of those up to 1 million migrants is extremely concerning, and many here believe needs to be dealt with very quickly. So it was here on the Champs-Élysées last Saturday, just after CNN had aired those pictures for the first time, Lynda, that a wildcat protest took place. They hadn't even bothered to have the authorization. The anger was such that people really came out onto the street. The police weren't really prepared, and the passion unleashed was such that they really struggled to contain it. What we've seen is another protest again yesterday, this one planned, a 3rd one today, but the numbers really getting smaller each time. Still, those who take part say they're determined to keep up the pressure, to keep the momentum, because they want changes to be made, they want action to be taken, so that this modern-day slave trade in the 21st century is brought to an end.
Yeah, we can only hope their voices are heard. Melissa Bell for us in Paris, thank you very much. And we are going to stay on this story now. Joining us from London with more on this case of modern-day slavery, Aiden McQuade, the former director of Anti-Slavery International, where he worked for human rights across Africa and the Middle East. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Firstly, give us your reaction to the expose on CNN, which revealed the human slave trade in Libya.
Well, I mean, the reports of this sort of practice of the trafficking of human beings in Libya have been pretty constantly coming out of Libya for the past year or so. So it's great tribute to CNN that they've put human faces to this and pricked the conscience of the world in this way. It's appalling. I can't say I'm shocked, or can't say I'm surprised, rather, because slavery associated with war is as old as war itself, and yet the humanitarian and peacekeeping indeed state-building operations of the international community only seem to be stumbling upon this realization very recently, and consequently there aren't the proper systems in place for either humanitarian response or peacekeeping that would have any chance of properly mitigating this or beginning to discourage those who are currently taking the opportunity of the chaos of war in order to enslave vulnerable people.
France, of course, has called on Libya to act against what they call these crimes against humanity, and the African Union has also condemned it. What do you make of Libya's response so far? They say they've opened an investigation since seeing that footage by CNN.
Yes, that's rather underwhelming, I think, given the fact that there were credible reports coming out of Libya for at least the past year about this. I think it's tribute to the pressure that CNN's brought to bear on them, but it's wholly unsatisfactory in terms of getting an adequate response to this issue. But I think, and speaking as a European, I think what Europe must face up to responsibility for this as well, where so much European policy towards the crisis in the Mediterranean, including the refugee flow out of Libya, has been about reducing the flow of migration rather than providing proper refugee status, proper migration routes, safe migration routes for vulnerable people in this situation. All of European policy has been poisoned by the xenophobic anti-migrant rhetoric which is being championed by a lot of extreme right-wing politicians right across Europe, from the UK to Hungary. And the consequence of that is not just the deaths that we're seeing in the Mediterranean, but also the slave markets of Libya. And there's some very prominent supposed anti-slavery leaders within Europe who are championing these anti-migration policies as well. And they can't honestly be doing both. If they wish to be champions against slavery, they must also address the issue of safe migration for vulnerable people at this very moment in the Mediterranean basin.
So when you look at who's at fault, how much responsibility should the EU take, given they did put Libya in this position to hold on to migrants, a developing country, to pretty much hold migrants back from making that journey across the Mediterranean?
Yeah, I mean, I think the EU must take about 50% of the responsibility in this as well. I mean, clearly there are some honourable exceptions within this, such as Germany and Sweden, but generally speaking, the European Union, it is not one of its finest hours. And given that we are a continent that has emerged from war and from the dreadful refugee flows of the 1940s, we should know better than this. And we should be addressing this with much greater humanity, with much greater sensitivity to our own history and the lessons of our own history, as well as to the pressures and demands of the present.
Aiden, McQuade, good to get your perspective on this, and we will stay on this story. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, still to come on CNN Newsroom, US President Donald Trump takes a pass on an honour that may have never even been offered to him. The dispute over Time's Person of the Year award next.